Hello, I'm Alex, and in this Blender tutorial, I'll share with you some of the most important hair particle settings that I use in creating various hairstyles. Here I have prepared an example of a hairstyle that I have created for this video tutorial, but I'll also show you how to create a brand new particle system and which settings to adjust. I also want to share with you this guide that I made, which will be used in explaining all the different settings. You'll be able to download this guide by using the link in the description. And if you have any questions while watching this video, please let me know in the comments so I may address them. So let me turn off the example hair. And as you can see, I have a mesh that is a separate piece of geometry for the scalp. And we'll create a brand new particle system by clicking on this plus button. It's in the hair properties tab. So by default, it will create a particle that is in a emitter, and we'll need to switch it to hairs. So as you can see, it created a particle system in form of these hairs. And we'll first have a look at the emission settings. First, let's adjust the hair length. Right now it's 4 meters. Let's put it to something more manageable, to 0.1. And you can set the number of these hairs in this slider. The seed sort of randomizes the positioning of these hairs. Let's reset that. And segments will define how many segments each separate piece of hair has. So if you have a look right now, we have 5. And if we switch to particle edit, you see that each particle has 5 segments in it. So let's select this one and let's zoom closer. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 segments in each particle. So that's how you define the segments. Also keep in mind that if you start editing the particle system, if you go to the particle edit and you start grooming the hairs and you go back to the object mode and try to adjust the emission settings, they will no longer be available to you since the particles have moved and you're no longer able to adjust all these settings. So keep that in mind before you start grooming the hair. Make sure you set proper length, proper number, and the segments that you desire. This will serve as a good sort of base for your hair. Okay, let's continue exploring the options. And next we have source. I usually don't touch this. This is by default is set to faces. You can set to vertices, faces, or volume. I don't touch this area at all. And hair dynamics as well. I haven't played with this. Most likely this is for the hair simulation system. Next we have render settings. In this tab you'll be able to set what the hairs are rendered as. You have these options here. I also don't touch that. It's just set to path. And materials are the materials that you have created, and you're able to switch different materials for your hair. I have created a few different materials which are for Cycles and for Eevee. These are the render engines native to Blender. So each one renders them sort of a little bit differently, so you can play around with that and see the results that you can create. Perhaps in the next part I will create a separate video on. Alright, up next we have the show emitter option. Our current emitter is the scalp mesh. So this is where the hair grows from. And if we don't want it to show up in our final render, we simply disable this option. So when you render it, the scalp mesh will not appear in your final render. So this is kind of useful if you want to disable it and you don't want it to show in your final render. You simply disable this option. Alright, moving on to B-spline. If I have this option on, you see that the hair will become more smooth. Let me just match the viewport display to the same strand steps count. I'll put that to 3. And if I take this on and off, you can see what is happening here. So if it's on, the profile of the strand becomes like a little bit more smooth, more averaged out. The only drawback that I noticed here is that the hair sort of become a little bit lifted from the scalp, from the emitter itself. So this may be an unwanted effect, but it depends on the look that you're going for. It may be something that you prefer to have like a little bit more smooth or not. This is really an option that is up to you to decide if you want to have this on or off. So the strand steps will define how smooth the curve is. If I decrease this number to 1 and to 3, you can see that the curve becomes subdivided. I usually don't put this number past 5 or 6. For medium hairstyle, like 6 works like very well already. If you're working on a really long hair, you may bump it up to 7 or even 8. Just keep in mind that it may increase your render times. So this setting is for render. You can see this is for the render, the final output image, and viewport image will show you exactly what it will look like in real time. So if I put this to 3 and this to 3, this. All right, moving on to our next option is children. So for children, you will have an option to select either simple or interpolated. And let me pull up our guide. I'll show you what that means. So in simple, this is simple and interpolated methods. The simple version will have the children positioned around the parent curve based on the radius. And in interpolated, the children will be evenly distributed between the parent guide curves. So you can see that the children amount will be exactly the same, but you can see the different result. And let me close this out and show you the example with our hair setup. If I select simple, you will see that, sometimes you will just get this weird look. That's just because the radius is way too big, and I will bump this down to 0.01. Now you can see, maybe it is hard to see. Let me decrease the amount of our parents so you can see exactly what that means. So if I select all of our parent curves and I go to select random, and I will get rid of 90% of our curves randomly. Now you can see more clear that based on the radius, the radius will define how close the children are to the parent curve. So let's say I want like 0.1, and I can also increase the amount of children here. And so here's the display amount, and this is the render amount. If you start grooming the hair, if you start like styling, perhaps it's better to decrease the display amount to like a low number. And if you want to see what it looks like in the final render, you can bump this up to the desired amount. So if I put 100 in the render amount, it will render out 100 particles. But while I'm styling the hair, maybe it could be very difficult on the machine to render those in real time. So this is the difference between these two. Again, this is the viewport display. So if I put 10 and 10 here, they will match exactly to the same number. And next option is the length. Of course, you can define the length. I usually don't put this much lower than my particle hair length, because I can define the length when I groom the hair. When I start grooming the hair, then I will define the length. So the length of the hair in the setting cannot be increased past 1, and 1 is the maximum length of your guide curve, which is the parent hair strand. You can always make it shorter, but you cannot go past 1. This is the full length, and this is half length, and you can decrease it even to a smaller number. How I like to use this option is I noticed that if I put this setting to about like 0.9 and I put threshold to 0.5, it will give me a little better look of the tips, how the tips of the hair will look. It will give it like a little bit more natural, randomized look to the end of the tips. To show you better, let me increase the amount of children to 50. And you can see that here they're sort of like have a little bit randomized length. One is a little bit shorter, one is a little bit longer. And if I put it back to 1, you can see that all the tips get same length, which is, you know, maybe undesirable. If I put this to 0.9, you can see that the tips become, you know, you can play with the setting and see how far you want to take it, but I like to give this length a little bit shorter to about, I play in the range between 0.8 and 0.9, somewhere there. And also you can play with the threshold setting to see how much of this randomized look the hair will get. Okay, and the seed will sort of give it a little random number to how they're positioned, but essentially they don't change their location in global scale. Next we have size and randomness. I'm not sure what these settings do. If anybody knows, let me know in the comments. I haven't found any use for this. I haven't found any differences when I adjust these settings, so let me know if you know what they do. Next we have radius. I already showed you what this setting does. It will position the children next to their parents based on the distance. And roundness will give the hair clump a little bit of roundness to it. The best way to define it, I guess. I'll show you in the guide what the setting actually does. If you have like, this is a regular clump, and if you adjust the roundness to, you put it to 1, the roundness will give the whole clump. I'm not sure why it does that to the roots, but it will also make the shape of the clump not only at the tips round, but also at roots round. And this is in a simple setting. I'm not sure why that is happening, but you know, in the clump you may actually find this option useful to make the clump a little bit more rounded. I do find use for this roundness setting. So once again, this roundness will be at 0, it will be just flat, and rounded out if you put it all the way to 1. So once again, to show you the effect, I will hide our mannequin head, and let me turn this length to 1 and threshold to 0 so you can see it better. This is roundness turned all the way up to 1, so you can see that it sort of extends like in the middle. It's sort of like start to bulge out, and for some reason it also does that to the roots. I think like the roots should be stationary, they shouldn't really do anything, but this is the effect that is happening here. Perhaps in the future updates it will be fixed. I'm not sure why this would be useful, but this is the effect that it does also to the roots. I found that it is useful to the tips, but the roots, I believe, shouldn't do that. Anyway, this is the effect that is happening, and let's move on to the next one. Okay, and our next effect is clumping. You can either input numbers. I usually just like to use the graph. I always turn this on, use clump curve, and I can define the clumping, the profile curve of the clump that is happening. So you can see if I pull this out, this will define sort of my profile view of the clump. So if it's like this, my clump will also look like this. And if I make it inward, my clump also gets that exact shape. And you can add more points here, so you can really specify how you want the clump to look. So this is that curve. If you need to make it a little puffy at the tips, you can bring this up. So you just play around with these settings here. Here we can define the twist of the strand. Let's put this to 1, and let me just decrease the radius of the hairs themselves so you can see the better effect. Let's put this to 0.1, and let's go back to our twist curve. So once again, this is similar effect as clumping. If I put it like this in a profile view, you can see that it twists more at the bottom and it doesn't twist at all right here. So if I reverse this, you will see that it will twist more towards the end. And if I keep increasing the root, it will start twisting more and more from the tip to the root. So here you can define in the profile view how much of the effect you want it based on that curve. So let's just remove that and continue to the clump noise. Clump noise, I'm not actually sure what that does. It's a very strange setting. I usually just avoid it. In roughness, we can define the settings of how rough the hairs will display or how rough the clump will display. So here you have an option to use roughness curve, and I find that this roughness curve is more limited than all these separate settings. So I actually don't use this roughness curve, because with these settings you can define more specifically the appearance of how each clump will look, well, how the hair will be displayed in terms of roughness. So for this uniform, it will give irregularity to the clump. You can see here it will give like a, it sort of will offset it. And with the size, this is kind of like the frequency factor, how frequent this wave will happen. So let me go back to actually one of our earlier settings. In the display view, I want to increase the strand steps so that we have more sections, more segments for our hairs. That way we can see what is happening better. So I turned our viewport display, and don't forget, sometimes you will need to also bump up your render display, because sometimes you have this in your render viewport and then you render out and it's a different result. So don't forget that there's the render setting that you need to match to the viewport display. And so we're now where's our roughness settings are here. And so here you can see how each clump gets this irregularity, and here's the frequency of how frequent you want this wave to happen. So I tend not to go too overboard with this. Of course, it depends on the style. If you're doing like a very curly hair, you may bump this up. It's all up to you how you want to use this setting. And next we have endpoint. Endpoint is, it will usually spread the ends, the tips of the clump. You can see the effect, and the shape will define where this effect will happen. So if I increase this number, it will only happen at the tips, and if I increase, it will go also spread to the roots as well. So if it's at 0, it's completely, you can see the spread happening to the whole clump. And if I start increasing this and I bump this up to 10, you can see that it only happens at the tips. The random size and threshold settings are, I use them in most of the setups. They give a really nice break up to the hair. Let me show you what that does. I'll just reset our previous settings so that we know exactly what these 3 settings are doing. So you can see that they really give that roughness. When you think of roughness, this is the roughness that you're looking for. And the size, this is the frequency of how rough. The frequency is more like a wave, so you can define like how wavy, like how frequent the wave is happening. And then threshold, I also love this setting because in most of hairs, some hairs will look more straight and some will be more uneven, where some of the hairs will fly away, or they're not just they don't stick all of, like 100% of the hairs like stick to one clump. Like for example, like here's a clump, but you can see like a few hairs just sort of separate, and it gives it that very natural look to the hairs. So these 3 settings, I love these settings, and I use them in most hair setups. Hair shape will define what the profile view of each individual hair will look like. So if I bump up this to 0.1, you can see exactly what that does. So I can use this hair shape slider to see if I want the tip to be thicker or thinner, and in these diameter, root, and tips, you can define how much of, this is the tip, how much of a thickness you want to add to the tip, or how thin you want the root to happen. So these sort of act as in like these profile views. I think it would be actually much easier if we had these. So devs, if you're listening, could you add these kind of profile views to the hair shape setting? It would make life much easier. Let me just pull up the guide and show you exactly what I mean. So I've had like a trial and error with these kind of settings, and most of the time I find out I use this kind of setting where the root is sort of like a little bit thinner, because the transition from scalp to the body of the hair should happen like smoother, not like here where it just like it's very thick. I find that this works better where the value is at 0.9 and the diameter, root diameter is actually smaller than the tip diameter, and you can achieve all these different profiles with these kind of settings. Yeah, so if you need if you're playing with these settings and you cannot really achieve what you're looking for, you can pull up this guide, and it will be easier for you to define the profile view of the hairs. Okay, one more setting that I missed here is the kink, which gives you sort of several options as to, there's very specific things that you can do to the hair strands, as curl, radial, wave, braid, or spiral. I have used a couple of them in the past, mostly curl and wave. Sometimes you may have the need to use braid if you're creating that type of hairstyle, and let me show you how that works. Let me first adjust some of these settings so we can see better what is happening. Let's add some more children amount, and let's select curl. By default, you may have like some of these numbers may be too high, so you'll need to adjust some of them. So this is amplitude. You see the amplitude was really high, so we will set this to something reasonable, and some of these settings are also similar as we went over in other settings, such as frequency or shape. Shape will define how much of this curl will affect the strand. So will it affect only like the bottom, or maybe top as well, or the whole strand? And so this is the amplitude. Flatness, I believe, is how flat the strand will look. So right now it's sort of like if you look from the top, and the parent will be in the middle, and so this is sort of like a circle. So if you do a flatness, it will create like a flat sort of shape. You see, it sort of becomes a little bit more flatter, sort of like a surface. And of course, frequency is the how much it repeats the wave. Radial, not sure what this does. Clump. Yeah, I remember this one is a very kind of specific look, where it will have like a sort of, when on a longer hair you will put like a rubber band around it, so it will create this sort of bulged out look. Wave, let's again decrease the amount to, so this is sort of like a wavy hairstyle if you want to create a look that, where the hairstyle, has some curl to it, or rather wave, because curl is a different shape. Wave is only, I guess, on one plane, whereas curl goes in a spiral. And we have a braid also. You can create a braid if you find the braid to be looking a little too sparse. You can always add the amount of children, so it will look more full. So you can play around with that. 400. And when we go back to the settings, you can also define all these different parameters. I think 0.01 was it? Flatness doesn't do anything here, and frequency, how often the braid will happen. Same for the shape. If you want to be a little tighter, I guess, you can adjust the setting. So these are kinks, are, these would be like very rather specific to the hair type, and you can use it to your advantage to save you some time on styling the hair. So finally, let me show you how interpolated method is different from the simple method of children hair. So here we have a simple right now, and if I switch it to interpolated, you can see that all these gaps that we previously had, again simple, interpolated, all the gaps between the parent curves have been filled out. Let me show you my guide again to show you exactly what it does. So simple, we have a curve, the parent curve, and the children are located in the proximity of the defined radius. And the interpolated method spreads those children evenly between each guide curve. And so here you can see exactly, you see, if I switch to interpolated, all the hairs are sort of evenly distributed. The scalp has been filled out with the hairs. So this is the main difference. And other than that, All these other settings are pretty much same, as in simple method, so simple and interpolated. Once again, in the guide curve I created, in my guide about the hair particles, I have this column is for simple and this is for interpolated settings, and as you can see, all the settings are pretty much same, except I believe is just for this one, and the twist seems to be missing in the interpolated method. So this is the main difference. And one other thing that I like to use with the interpolated method is the use of vertex groups. So let me show you. They're located all the way at the bottom. And here you can define, with the vertex groups, you can define the density of the hair, the length of the hair, and all these other settings, clump, kink, roughness. So based on the defined vertex groups, you can set the hair parameters. Let me show you what that looks like. So if I turn off the hair particles just for a moment and I switch to my weight paints, I have defined the weight of the vertices here. I'll switch to the vertex groups. It's located here in this tab, Object Data Properties. So here I have created previously some of these vertex groups, and I'll show you in another video how to do that. So you can create all these different so-called maps, which will define the density of your hair or length for your hair. And this is a good way to sort of create these faded looks for the hair. So this is what it looks like. So if when I use this vertex group, the red means that the hair in the red region, the hair will grow 100%, and in the blue it will be completely absent or very short. And let's switch back to the particles. I'll switch back to object mode, and let me just turn off a couple of, I want to get rid of the kink. Where is it located? It's located in children, and we'll remove the kink to nothing. So now if I go down to, let me just make sure we're in interpolated, and if I go to vertex groups and I'll switch to one of the preset vertex groups top, you can see that the density has been adjusted based on that map. So you can see that in the back I showed you previously, the blue areas will have less amount of hair, the density. And let me remove this and I'll switch to the length. If I put that preset there, you can see that the length is now also set based on that map of the vertex group. So on top, as I said, the hair will grow, like the length will be 100%, and the back will start fading away based on that map. So this is good for creating these faded haircuts. So if I create that vertex groups, I can easily switch between them and create a brand new different look. So this is, I have created like a mohawk preset. So if I switch to mohawk, you can see that now that hair has been cut based on the vertex group. So this is a good way to easily switch between different kind of faded looks. So this is a little bit faded. Taper has like a little bit less length in the back where the hair starts to grow, and you sort of fade it out. So these are the main reasons why you would use the vertex groups here with the interpolated method. You can also use them with the simple method. but as I said earlier, like simple will have these kind of gaps. They're a little bit harder to fill out, and if you switch to interpolated, all the hairs are now like evenly distributed, and it's best to use interpolated for these perhaps shorter hair where you can take advantage of the vertex groups and create these faded hairstyles. So the last thing that I want to mention to you in this tutorial is to show you how the hair renders in the viewport. There's a setting, if you go to the Render Properties tab, there's a setting in the Curves submenu for rendering how the curves will render out as a strand or a strip. And I like to use strip because the hair have a little bit more natural look to them. That means that the hairs will fade out at the end, especially like the tips. So you can see that strand will have same thickness throughout the length of the hair, and the strip gets a little bit more faded look. One other thing, if I go back to the hair settings and I want to adjust the radius of the hair itself, the diameter, hair shape, and I scale the diameter, you see that the hair is not affected in the strand menu. And if I switch to strip, the diameter will be able to adjust. So you can see that you have better control as far as what the hair will look like. You can adjust diameter, tip, or root, and overall scale of the hair radius. And once again, if I switch to strand, it's sort of disabled again. So I'm not sure if this is a bug or there's a reason for why it does that, but that's why I always switch to strip by default. So these are all the settings that I mainly use for styling hair, and if you have any questions about this tutorial, please let me know in the comments. Also, if you found this video useful, give it a like, that way I know there's demand for this type of content, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.